Well, the reasons that I did what I did in April of 1985 were personal, banal, and amounted really to kind of greed and folly. Simple as that.
To me, Rick was the worst kind of traitor, and I always said he could have worked for the KGB, given them pages and pages and pages of information that wouldn't have cost somebody their life.
In the early 1980s, Aldrich Ames sat inside the CIA's Soviet division, surrounded by files, cables, and access most agents would never see. He wore cheap suits, drank heavily, and often arrived late. But none of that mattered. What mattered was what he could access, and what he chose to sell. Ames wasn't driven by ideology. He wasn't working to change the world. He wanted money. And in 1985, he walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and offered up U.S. secrets in exchange for cash, $50,000 to start. Over the next 9 years, he would pass along names, networks, and classified operations. And in doing so, he would become the most damaging mole in CIA history.
To the minute he was arrested, he had no idea he was in trouble.
He really didn't think he had anything to worry about, that we would never, ever pinpoint him. But he was wrong.
Dozens of CIA assets were exposed. Some vanished. Some were never heard from again.
That men like Polyakov gave up names. They gave up secrets. I did the same thing. For reasons that I considered sufficient to myself. I gave up the names of some of the same people who had earlier given up others. It's a nasty kind of circle with terrible human costs.
Ames had been with the CIA since 1962. He came from a family of intelligence officers and understood how to blend in. By 1983, he had access to the most sensitive programs in the agency's Soviet files: covert operations, recruitment efforts, source identities. It was a gold mine. He fed it all to the KGB, and they paid him handsomely. The shocking part? No one inside the CIA noticed, at least not for a long time. Ames paid cash for a $500,000 home, bought a Jaguar, showered his new wife with gifts and international travel. His bank flagged it. His neighbors noticed, but his own agency didn't. Inside the CIA, he was still seen as sloppy, but loyal, the perfect cover for the worst kind of leak. The CIA would later call it one of the darkest years in its history.
Trying to pin down a counterintelligence case when you're looking for a mole is always a very difficult and long-term job.
In 1985 alone, the Soviet Union quietly began dismantling nearly every Western intelligence operation inside its borders. Contacts stopped showing up. Field agents lost communication. Whole networks collapsed.
You have to go back to 1985 when we started losing some of our best sources who were Soviet officials. And people began to realize that there was something wrong and that it needed to be looked into. But back in those days, we didn't know that we were going to be involved in a mole hunt.
Ames had handed over the identities of America's most valuable assets, men and women who had risked everything to provide classified Soviet military and political information. Some were immediately recalled, others were arrested. The damage was fast, precise, and devastating. And still, no one suspected Ames. He was promoted, transferred, and praised. Meanwhile, the CIA's presence in Moscow was effectively shut down. Ames didn't live like most spies. There were no fake identities or hidden bunkers. He flaunted his wealth openly. He bought a large house in Arlington, Virginia, paying over $500,000 in cash. He drove a luxury Jaguar. His wife, Rosario, spent freely. And the couple traveled internationally on a diplomat's salary. It didn't add up, and banks noticed. Financial auditors noticed. Even other agents noticed. But inside the CIA, there was a culture of looking the other way. Ames was sloppy, but he was one of them. He explained the money away as coming from his wife's family, and it worked for years. The truth was simpler. The Soviets were paying him hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. By the end of his spying career, he had earned over $4.6 million from the KGB. not for ideology, just for betrayal. As the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, the full scale of Ames's betrayal became impossible to ignore.
The KGB suddenly started to arrest the CIA's most important Soviet spies.
Agents who had been trusted, protected, and carefully cultivated over years were suddenly gone. Intelligence coming out of Moscow had dried up. The CIA had no reliable eyes or ears inside Russia, and worse, the KGB knew things they shouldn't have. Investigators began retracing their steps. Too many failures, too many coincidences. They reviewed internal files, budget reports, and personnel records. That's when they noticed Ames's lifestyle, the cash transactions, the overseas bank accounts, the financial audits that were buried. Suspicion finally found its mark. The CIA didn't know exactly what he'd done yet, but they knew they had a problem inside their own house, and it had already cost them everything.
We started with a list of names of people who had access to all the cases we lost.
There is the famous or infamous list of 198 people that we drew up, and those are people with access. They are not suspects.
And then it didn't take me too long to eliminate most of them. But once we got down to our 3, you had to put them in rank order. Well, the first person I put down anyway was Rick.
Once Ames became a suspect, the CIA and FBI didn't move quickly. They moved carefully, quietly. They set up surveillance teams, monitored his calls, tailed him to and from work. They placed bugs in his car and microphones in his house. They watched everything, his routine, his meetings, even his grocery runs. Ames, still unaware he was under suspicion, continued his usual behavior. He visited foreign embassies, made unexplained cash withdrawals, took sudden trips. Each move was documented. Every file he accessed was logged. What they found confirmed their worst fears. They had a mole, and his reach was bigger than they imagined. But they couldn't afford to act on instinct. They needed airtight proof, the kind that would stand up in court and in the eyes of the world. The turning point came in early 1994. After years of leaks, damaged operations, and growing internal pressure, the FBI and CIA decided to act. On February 21st, Ames was arrested outside his home in Arlington, Virginia. His wife was arrested shortly after. The raid wasn't just about stopping a mole, it was about reclaiming credibility.
Shock, depression, instant recognition of, one's life flashes before one. A sense of things coming to an end, but no sense of relief is much more painful than that.
Inside Ames's home, investigators found evidence of his contacts with the KGB, classified documents, and financial records tracing the flow of Soviet money. The story unraveled quickly. Ames confessed. The scale of the betrayal became clear. Names, operations, strategic plans. Everything he had touched was compromised. The damage wasn't just operational, it was personal. Officers who had worked beside him felt deceived. Entire teams had been exposed. The CIA had been infiltrated from within, and no one had noticed. Ames's arrest wasn't just a headline. It triggered a reckoning inside American intelligence. How had one man operated for nearly a decade without detection? How had signs of financial irregularities, suspicious behavior, and access abuse all gone unnoticed? Or, worse, ignored? Congressional hearings followed. Internal audits were launched. New security protocols were implemented. But the reputational damage was already done. The CIA had failed to protect its most valuable assets, both at home and abroad. Morale plummeted, trust fractured. And among allied agencies worldwide, a new question emerged. If the CIA couldn't catch a mole in its own house, who else had slipped through? One of the most haunting legacies of the Ames case wasn't just what was lost, but what was never acknowledged. For years, U.S. intelligence had no clear answers for why missions failed or why trusted sources suddenly vanished. Some assumed they had simply gone dark. Others were blamed for their own exposure. But behind the scenes, Ames had quietly removed them from play. And in many cases, no explanation was ever given. Families were left with questions. Operatives in the field were never warned. Even after his arrest, the full extent of the fallout was hard to trace. That was the power of what Ames had done. He didn't just hand over files, he disrupted trust, erased identities, and left entire intelligence channels in ruins. In April 1994, Aldrich Ames pleaded guilty to espionage. The courtroom wasn't filled with drama. No denials, no grand speeches. He admitted what he had done. He named his contacts. And in doing so, he avoided a lengthy trial. His wife also pleaded guilty to lesser charges and received a 5-year sentence. Ames was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never leave federal custody. For some in the agency, it was a moment of closure, but for others, it was too late. The cost wasn't just intelligence lost. It was lives altered, alliances shaken, and a shadow cast over an entire era of operations. The mole had been caught, but the damage was done. In the aftermath, the Ames case became a textbook example of what can happen when internal oversight fails. It forced the CIA and other intelligence agencies to rethink how access was granted, how financial red flags were handled, and how agents were monitored. Even those with decades of experience, new systems were introduced, polygraphs were updated, financial disclosures were tightened. But the deeper question remained: how do you truly measure loyalty? Ames had passed every background check. He had worked alongside respected colleagues. He had even trained new recruits, and yet, for nearly a decade, he sold out everything. In the world of espionage, trust is the currency, and Aldrich Ames had spent it all. Ames wasn't the first mole, and he wouldn't be the last. Just 7 years after his arrest, the FBI uncovered another devastating breach. Robert Hansen, an agent who had also been spying for the Soviets for decades. Like Ames, Hansen had access, seniority, and a quiet routine that made him seem above suspicion. The similarities were alarming. 2 top-level American agents, operating in different agencies, leaking secrets to the same enemy, for money. The intelligence community realized it had a deeper issue. This wasn't just a lapse in judgment or a single bad actor. It was a systemic vulnerability, one that required not just better security, but a culture shift inside the very agencies tasked with protecting secrets. From the Soviet perspective, Ames was more than just a source. He was a windfall. His intel helped the KGB dismantle entire CIA networks. It gave them insight into U.S. operations, diplomatic strategies, and internal vulnerabilities. He provided names, schedules, asset profiles, and most importantly, he confirmed who was working for the West. The KGB even created internal files to track how often they had acted on his information. He wasn't just useful. He was considered one of the most valuable American assets the Soviet Union had ever handled. For less than $5 million, they had turned one of the CIA's own against them, and it had worked, better than they could have imagined. The story of Aldrich Ames isn't just about betrayal. It's about what betrayal looks like from the inside. It's about the dangers of routine, the blind spots that come from familiarity, and the ease with which damage can be done when trust is assumed. Intelligence agencies are built on secrets, but when those secrets are weaponized from within, the damage spreads fast and invisibly. Files can be reclassified, agents can be recalled, but trust? That's harder to rebuild. In the wake of Ames, the intelligence world became more paranoid, more cautious, and more closed, and for good reason. Once you've been burned from the inside, you never look at your own team the same way again. Behind every file Ames leaked, there was a name, a face, a life that had been risked and ultimately exposed. Many of those compromised would never return to their old lives. Some were imprisoned, others simply disappeared. And for those who survived, the sense of betrayal ran deeper than fear. These were people who believed in something, who trusted the agency that recruited them, who risked their families, their futures, and their freedom. When Ames handed over their identities, it wasn't just strategy, it was personal. And while the official response remained clinical, redacted reports, internal memos, the emotional damage couldn't be measured. Trust wasn't just broken, it was erased. Ames's new reality is a long way from the corridors of Langley. He's serving life without parole in a high-security federal prison, locked away for 23 hours a day, no internet, no contact with the outside world beyond monitored visits and letters. Occasionally, he gives interviews, and in them, he shows little remorse. He talks about money, about mistakes, but not about consequences, not about the people whose lives were destroyed.
I knew quite well when I gave the names of our agents in the Soviet Union that I was exposing them to the full machinery of counter-espionage and the law and prosecution and capital punishment, certainly in the case of KGB and GRU officers. Obviously, these folks I knew would have to answer for what they'd done. And certainly I felt I inured myself against a reaction to that.
For some, his imprisonment is justice. For others, it feels hollow. The damage he caused didn't end with his arrest. It lingered in policy changes, fractured alliances, and the quiet fear that another Ames might still be out there, just waiting to be found. Today, Aldrich Ames is more than a former agent. He's a warning. His story is taught in training programs across the intelligence world, not as history, but as a living lesson. How someone can manipulate trust, how red flags can be missed, how access, unchecked, becomes a weapon. His case reshaped how the CIA handles internal audits, financial reviews, and employee monitoring, but it also left a deeper scar, a cultural one. Inside the agency, loyalty is no longer assumed. Background checks are stricter, surveillance is more intense, and the question always lingers: if it happened once, could it happen again? Ames didn't just break the rules, he changed them. Most spies vanish into history. Ames didn't. His name remains etched in every conversation about internal betrayal. In the decades since his arrest, journalists, historians, and former operatives have returned to his story again and again. Not just because of what he did, but because of how long he got away with it. He wasn't a shadowy figure operating under fake names. He was a familiar face in the halls of Langley, a desk away. A man who drank too much and showed up late. And that's what makes his betrayal so unsettling. He didn't hide in the dark. He was standing in the light, and still, no one saw him for what he was. Ames has never become the kind of pop culture figure that James Bond fans would know. But among those who follow true espionage stories, he's infamous. Documentaries, books, and dramatizations have explored his case in detail, not to glamorize it, but to understand it. What drives a person to trade trust for money? How does someone justify years of betrayal? In media portrayals, Ames is often shown as calm, deliberate, and shockingly ordinary. And maybe that's the point. The most dangerous threat isn't always the loudest. Sometimes it's the quiet man in the next office, the one you think you know. Today, the CIA is more guarded, more paranoid, and more self-critical than it was before Ames. His betrayal didn't just compromise sources. It rewired the agency's thinking. New systems were built to prevent another internal collapse. But systems don't catch everything. Technology evolves, threats shift, and the nature of loyalty remains just as complex as ever. Ames didn't bring down the CIA, but he cracked its foundation. And decades later, his name still echoes through its halls, not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a reminder. The greatest danger isn't always outside the walls. Sometimes it's sitting behind the badge.